in that imposing federal courthouse in the center of Washington, D.C. Today is no ordinary trial. Today is one of those moments when a nation confronts itself. The courtroom, with its high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and heavy curtains, was once not only the home of justice, but also a sacred space where silence reigned. Today, that silence is like the tension before a storm. Everyone is silent because the same questions echo inside everyone. Will the truth be revealed here, or will it be hidden once more? Judge Eleanor Braddock took her seat on the high bench of the federal court. She raised her head slightly. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, as if searching the faces for destiny. In her gaze was the weight of years of judgments, oaths, and conscience. If it were possible to stop this moment, you would want to focus on that second when the trial began. Because at that very moment, Braddock changed the floor of the hall with his words. This trial is not just about one man's betrayal, but about the games that play in the shadow of a system. This court will hear not only the law, but the conscience. Why do you think? Why would a judge say that? Is this just a legal issue, or is it something more? There was a bowing of heads in the audience. Some averted their eyes. Others began to observe the jury's movements. The jurors opened their notebooks, but we don't know what they noted. The truth, the intonation, or the chill in the room. Our eyes drift to the defense bench. Roy Holden is there. He's out of uniform, but his posture is still that of a soldier. His shoulders are squared, his eyes fixed on something, perhaps the court clock, perhaps a memory that will never return. For him, silence is not only peace, it's a shield. Because he still carries the voice inside him that told him he should not go to Iowa that day. And do you think, can a pilot question his orders? What if it's not in the public interest? Roy's testimony is rock solid. But remember, even the biggest storms start quietly. And now a new player on the scene, Marcus Vellon. He's sitting in the prosecutor's chair. His files are in order. His tie is impeccable. Those who know him call him the prosecutor of invisible files. He chooses to run, not walk, after the truth. But remember, every runner has a goal in mind. Do you think Marcus Vellon's goal is justice or just a victory? And here's the defense side. Sarah Langdon, quiet, but with an electrifying charisma. Her black jacket is like a suit of armor. She has a history of war trials. She knows when to speak and when to keep quiet. But this is no ordinary defense for her today. There's only one thing in his eyes. I'm defending not just a man, but a forgotten truth. He seems to be defending Roy Holden, but in fact he is standing up to the dark spots of the system. And he does it with conviction, not an oath. The doors are closed. The trial has officially begun. No more outside world. There's no going back. And do you think, is it just one man on trial in this courtroom? Or is it a much larger system? Before you go into this story, ask yourself, does justice always stand for what is right? Or is right sometimes left alone? When the door creaked open, the silence in the hall was once again interrupted. It was as if all eyes had been prepared for the footsteps of the person who would pass through. The voice of the court official echoed. Witness, Caroline Levitt. Footsteps echoed. Each step was like a secret rising to the surface. Caroline Levitt wore a plain white jacket. No jewelry, no makeup. Just a plain face, a straight posture, and a stony determination in her eyes. For her, this was not just a trial. This was the trial of the burden he had been carrying for years. This was the words accumulated in her throat finally finding their way. As he took his steps, his past was walking with him. Each step opened a door in his mind, and he was going back to that dark day. He stopped for a moment and took a deep breath. As she inhaled, The sound of that phone call from Iowa rang in her ear again. "I have something to give you, Caroline. This country needs to know the truth." A journalist, a friend, an idealist. Someone who was no longer alive, but whose voice still echoed in Caroline's heart. That moment was still fresh in her mind. The change of flight plan, the urgent appointment, the importance of documents, Holden's icy reply. When he took the podium, the hall fell silent again. Caroline stopped. She closed her eyes. She held her breath for a second. Then she slowly raised her hand. "I swear I will only tell the truth." For the first time, her voice was resolute. It was not shrill, but heavy as a stone, as if he had been silenced for years and now had to say everything in one breath. Every word he said would reach not only the courtroom, but millions of people behind the cameras. Perhaps for the first time, the public would hear what was happening in the background. Prosecutor Marcus Velen leaned forward slightly. He slowly put his pen down on the table and closed the files. He fixed his eyes on Caroline. For the first time during the trial, there was open curiosity on her face. "Can you tell us about the day of the flight, Mr. Levitt?" Caroline shook her head slightly. Her eyes shifted to Holden. She paused for a second. In her mind, that cockpit came to life again. The airplane hovering in the air, the silent sky, the calls not echoing from the radios. And Holden's face cold, determined, but as if listening to another order. Like he just wasn't there. In that moment, Caroline saw not just a soldier in the pilot's seat, but the carrier of something else. "I wanted to go to Iowa," he said. "A journalist. A friend of mine was waiting for me with documents that would shake the country." These documents were not just a few files. They symbolized the collapse of a public illusion woven with lies, seemingly mundane, but in reality evidence that would expose the inner workings of a system. A brief pause. Then his voice became a little clearer. "But Captain Holden refused my order. He didn't change his flight plan. First, he attributed it to technical reasons. Engine temperature, weather conditions, procedural limitations. But nothing could hide the truth. Then he disconnected the cabin. He didn't answer any calls. And then the prosecutor leaned forward a little more. Without even taking a breath, he asked, "And then?" Caroline lowered her eyes to the floor. She took a deep breath, then made eye contact again. "Lock the controls. The aircraft is closed to outside interference. Communication with the tower was lost. The signaling chain has been changed. Suddenly, we started receiving new frequencies, even though we were nowhere near any other aircraft. These were no ordinary signals. They were encrypted, impossible to trace, the kind only found in military protocols. And from that moment on, I was just a passenger. Control was taken from me." A murmur rose in the hall. Whispers mingled. The jurors began to move their pens. Some turned their gaze to Holden. The prosecutor moved to the second question. "When did you suspect that the defendant, Captain Holden, was serving someone?" Caroline squinted at Holden. She knew him. She knew he was distant. But this was something else. This was the absence of the man she knew. He was obeying an order system, not me. There was no fear or remorse in his eyes, only absolute devotion. He didn't hear my voice. This wasn't just a technical rebellion. It was a constructed loyalty. There was silence in the hall again. This time not a tense silence, but a deep silence. Everyone was thinking for the first time about how a system can dominate a person. The prosecutor's face became serious. He opened the files again. He turned over a document with his pen. "Mr. Levitt, these are very serious accusations. Do you have any other evidence? Something more concrete?" Caroline was silent for a moment. She lowered her eyes to the floor. Then she slowly reached into her handbag. She took out a carefully folded sheet of paper. There was a shaky but determined movement in her hands. She handed it not to the prosecutor, but directly to the judge. "This is the first signaling plan I received from the journalist. Holden's call sign is marked on it. This document was the first obstacle that prevented him from accessing the news source. And I believe that barrier was deliberate, not technical." Sarah Langdon shifted in her seat at the defense table. She placed one hand on her knee and kept the other on her pen. She stared at Caroline. She said nothing at that moment, but her eyes spoke. This woman was not only a witness against Holden, she was the other side of a warrior. And Sarah had fought that battle many times in other courts years ago. Judge Braddock took the document, studied it for a few seconds. He lowered his spectacles slightly and looked at Caroline. He nodded slowly. "The court accepts the document. Let the relevant copy be presented to the jury." Silence again replaced the words in the courtroom. But this time the silence was filled with another emotion, the weight of testimony. Caroline closed her eyes for a moment. She took a deep breath. It was as if for the first time she had spoken so openly about a secret she had not been able to get rid of for years. Something seemed to have been sucked out of her, a little tired, but lighter. The burden he had been carrying on his shoulders was shared for the first time. The person who entered through the back door was like a figure emerging from the shadows. Only his eyes were visible through his black hooded jacket. Neither his dress nor his gait was ordinary. His every step was silent but echoed in the hall. Silence was no longer just atmosphere, but a form of communication. The way the hall breathed changed with his presence. As he came, people sat up straighter and held their breath. It was as if everyone sensed that this person was not an ordinary witness, but a representative of a completely different plane. A warning, a sign, or a shadow, but definitely a secret. Code name, Tower 7. The officers took him to a specially isolated witness section. It was a compartment that could only be used by witnesses who knew state secrets. Microphones and cameras were silenced for a while. His identity was not made public. Even in the court building, only 3 people recognized him by his real name. The fact that he disguised himself only increased the power of what he had to say, because some truths survive only in disguise. Tower 7 was silent for a long time before he began his testimony. It was as if he was gathering courage instead of breathing. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice did not tremble. Finally he spoke. Roy Holden was not just a pilot. He was a special channel of communication. Codename Armor Mirror. A buzz spread through the courtroom. The air was filled with an invisible energy. A juror involuntarily dropped his pen. A journalist removed his earphones because he could no longer just hear. He had to understand. Tower 7 continued. Project Armor Mirror is a perception control system initiated many years ago. It is a technology that combines satellite signals, media frequencies, and targeted information manipulations. Holden was at the center of this structure. The routes he flew were set up to transmit signals, not just to carry passengers. He himself did not realize this at first. But as his duties increased, the rational explanation of orders diminished. And, at some point, the signals began to speak, not the orders. Sarah Langdon looked up. Her eyes were following Tower 7's every word. There was a change in his face. We'd seen that expression before that "this is it" moment. Things he'd already sensed, but couldn't prove, were now coming to the surface. And no evidence could be as shocking as the testimony itself. Tower 7 continued his testimony by handing him an envelope. The court officer took it carefully. Inside was a map showing Holden's routes and signal disturbances during his tour of duty. Some routes were specifically marked in red on the map. Independent analyses showed that these distortions matched instantaneous content changes in media outlets. I was part of this system. I took the instructions. I drew the maps. I prepared the signal tunnels. But I'm not anymore. I'm speaking here today because there is no one else left. And those who are left don't have the courage. These words were not just information, they were confession, a kind of penance. Judge Braddock intervened. His voice was measured but firm. This court judges concrete actions, not media projects. These allegations may form part of a new investigation. But at that moment, Caroline Leavitt stood up. There were no tears in her eyes, but the anger inside her was fierce. This was not a reflex. It was the outpouring of years of pent-up rage. It was not a voice, but a scream. But the lies started right here, Your Honor. Not in the air, but in this injustice. Braddock fell silent. The whole courtroom was silent. For maybe a minute, no one moved. Because everyone was now engaged in an invisible war described in the words mirror of armor. And no one could remain innocent anymore. Sarah Langdon stood up. Silently, she opened her bag. He held up the old notebook he took out of it. It was as if it held a centuries-old secret. The binding was worn, the edges were frayed, and there were no labels on it. There was a silence that spread throughout the hall. Eyes focused on the diary in his hands. Honorable jurors, this notebook is not just a few lines written by my client. It is the whisper of a conscience. This is the inner voice of a man standing in the crack between fear and loyalty. Langdon opened the notebook slowly. Among the yellowed pages, handwritten notes, dates, and cryptic symbols stood out. One in particular, 3 circles, an eye in the center. It was a special cryptological symbol used in military missions. A signal. A signal. Perhaps it was a warning. The diary wasn't just writing. There were codes in it. Fragmented paragraphs, incomplete sentences, but all part of a whole. Some were scribbled over, as if even Holden was afraid to face his own truth. But one word was clear. Armor mirror. Langdon started reading. September 19th. I got a call outside the chain of command. Codes are high level. The order doesn't mention Iowa. But I know. I need to get there. Because those documents contain a truth that only I can carry. Langdon closed the page. He put his hands on the notebook. He turned to face the jury. It shows a man's resistance, not blind obedience. If Holden is guilty, first judge the system that brought him to this point. He is guilty of nothing but a chain of command that has fallen into darkness. The jurors scrutinized the notebook. Some took notes, some read silently. Among the notes, one signature stood out. OK_KF. Sarah waited at this point, because this code was not just a name. It was a system code belonging to Prosecutor Vellen's former security advisor. The courtroom had suddenly moved to another plane. This was no longer Holden's case. This was now the internal showdown of a system. The morning after the trial, as the court was still in session, an urgent announcement pushed the courtroom door open. The deputy presiding judge entered, clutching the file tightly in his hand. His face was pale. The dark circles under his eyes were not only from fatigue, but also from fear. The courtroom was not yet full, but those inside sensed that the silence would not last long. And then the words cut through the air like an icy knife. The witness, codenamed Tower 7, was killed in an explosion in his vehicle on the motorway this morning. It was a simple sentence, plain, almost formal, but the effect was apocalyptic. A journalist's pen slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. His voice echoed in the empty hall. A middle-aged woman on the jury put her hands to her mouth. Her eyes widened, then glazed over. Sarah Langdon closed her eyes and bowed her head. She had that familiar look on her face. I knew it. She had expected that. But it didn't ease the pain. Caroline Levitt lowered her eyes to the floor, but she didn't cry. Her facial muscles were tight. Her chin did not tremble, because crying was now a luxury. "This is not an accident," she said quietly, almost in a whisper. "This is a silencing." Those who heard the words turned their heads towards him. No one objected, because we all know, don't we? When a witness remains silent, the lie prevails. But when a witness dies, the truth is frightened. Even Prosecutor Velen grimaced. This man was not known for showing emotion, but his eyelids drooped for a moment. His hands gripped the cover of the file tightly. Because no matter how powerful the system was, the death of those seeking justice did not make his job easier. It made it harder. Because there was no longer just a case, but a price. Nothing was said in the courtroom that morning. No one commented out loud. But the same sentence was going round and round inside everyone. Who's next? The day of the last hearing. As the morning dawned, the court building was already surrounded by riot police. Armored vehicles were stationed at the corners, and drones were silently patrolling the perimeter of the building. The entrance gate of court, open only to the authorities, opened slowly for the first time that morning. The darkness that had come before sunrise had crept not only into the sky, but also into the building. And then, a rumor spread. A cleaner found a black envelope in a rusted rubbish bin just outside the courthouse. The sentence inside the envelope was only 5 words, but it contained 1,000 questions. No one will be safe inside after 9 p.m. This note was immediately forwarded to the internal security units. The radios were alerted. No information was given to the press, but everyone inside felt the sudden change in the atmosphere. The air thickened. Time slowed down. Eyes became more careful, steps more cautious. All the while, there was silence inside. Indeed, it was as if time had frozen, rather than as if a bomb had exploded. Some spectators retreated. Some held on tighter to their seats. But no one left the hall, because everyone wanted to witness the end of an era. At 9:47, the door of the hall opened, and in stepped a figure dressed entirely in black, with a black mask over his face. Witness X. His face was invisible. Even his voice was not his own. A mechanical voice, echoing from a small metallic device, began to speak. The order to Captain Holden was relayed through the Clarion Foundation, owned by Olivia Kingsley. At that moment, the room tensed. A door opened, followed by a storm, because this was the first time a clear accusation had been made by a specific name. And that name was Olivia Kingsley. This woman was the owner of one of the biggest news networks in the country. Her close relations with politicians, her absolute influence over the media, the shaping of national perception almost at her fingertips. Now that name was in a court file. Witness X continued. Each sentence was as if he was cutting reality with a sharp knife. The Clarion Foundation, together with some members of the government, jointly controlled the media. The course changes given to Captain Holden were processed through the Preventive Information Protocol created by this foundation. There was a gasp in the courtroom. One juror bowed his head, another scratched his forehead. No one spoke, but everyone's eyes said the same thing. This is no longer just a case. This is a deconstruction. Witness X placed a small digital file carrier on the table. Security guards took it. A technician connected it to the system. The big screen switched on. 3 lines appeared on a gray background. These documents were not just technical reports. They were the digital fingerprints of an undeniable manipulation. Judge Braddock said nothing for a while. He took off his glasses, rubbed his forehead. Then, in a calm but firm voice, he spoke. This court, while accepting the evidence presented as valid, that a full-scale federal investigation of the Clarion Foundation, the Armor Mirror Project, and associated figures be instituted. There was a moment of silence in the courtroom. Then only a breath was heard. Perhaps everyone felt the same thing at that moment. The truth was really speaking for the first time. The jury deliberated for 3 days. At the end of the third day, the verdict was announced. The defendant, Roy Holden, is acquitted of the charge of treason against the state, but is found guilty of executing an unlawful order. The courtroom was silent. Holden bowed his head. Levitt stared at him. He had no hatred, but he had no answer. Judge Braddock made his final ruling. The defendant will receive a federal sentence of 12 years. This court finds it appropriate to institute federal review of the request for a special hearing on the in-state media manipulation and the Mirror of Armor. This was not just the end. It was the beginning. Weeks after the hearing, Caroline Levitt addressed the public in an independent video in which she broadcast her own voice. She no longer held a notebook, but a microphone. This is not a story. This is a living truth. And the truth, no matter how hidden, takes off. Behind him was the courthouse, and in the sky was an airplane. On its wings, in big letters, truth takes off. People raised their hands. Some cried. Some believed for the first time. But everyone understood. Nothing would ever be the same again.